No one's saying hi, Sophie, and I'm a little nervous.
Hi, Sophie.
Thank you, Sin. You sound a little different today. So, can you introduce yourself? Replacement Sin.
Yeah, hi, everybody. I'm St. Trina. Not the St. Trina you know from Elden Ring, but St. Trina from YouTube and Twitch. And basically, I do a lot of lore, and I like to use wild conspiracy theories to talk about, well, whatever the heck I want to. So I did gender expression before, and feminism and gender essentialism in video games as a whole. So there's lots to talk about in all those areas. So I'm super excited to talk to you, Sophie. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. And yeah, we're specifically going to talk about Saint Trina today because, like you were saying, this concept of different kinds of expression and gender and things is very relevant to that character. I mean, we're going to get into like what exactly is going on. There's a lot to talk about there, which is especially interesting given that they're not really in the game very much. A lot of it was removed.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's we'll talk about this way later on, but it looks like it's going to be part of the DLC.
Almost certainly.
But specifically, like when we were talking about what we wanted to discuss here, you said you were interested in the concept of a divine being who was able to create/destroy and to separate and combine. And that was sort of your jumping off point for talking about Miquella and St. Trina. So do you want to get into a little detail about that aspect?
Yeah. So my first project that I did, what I would call a good project. I did some more back in the Bloodborne days, but I just did a couple of articles on Reddit, you know. But when I came back to do Elden Ring stuff, I teamed up with another awesome content creator who you should check out, Gene from the Mix Files. They do drag history, like professionally. They make Elden Ring lore stuff as well. And the whole reason I'm bringing her up is because she was the one that said the line that kind of started me down this road, which is that if you look across different spiritualities, there are certain characteristics that gods always have that mortals don't have. And that's usually the power to create and destroy. And that usually involves their own self as well. Like a lot of gods are shapeshifters, etc. I'm getting slightly ahead of myself because we haven't really set up Miquella and St. Trina, but essentially the thing that makes Miquella and St. Trina more godly than other characters is their ability to transform.
Yeah.
What is godliness in the world of Elden Ring is the ability to control the world, to transform it into your own image. And if you can control your image, that's like another layer of godliness. And so I think it's really apt to use a character whose identity is not that clear, but also whose gender expression and literally physical form is unclear.
Yeah, and that's a constant thing throughout Elden Ring, not just with St. Trina.
Mm-hmm.
So you have these characters who are like, they're a composite being. Like you have like Rykard, who's also fused with the snake. You know, like Radagon and Marika's the obvious one. Like they're fused together.
Yeah, that's an easy one.
And then you have like characters who also have multiple identities.
Mm-hmm.
Godfrey is Hoarah, Morgott is Margit, and of course Miquella is St. Trina, which is something that like this is going to come up a lot, but basically, like, a lot of the St. Trina stuff did get removed, but we know what it was.
Right.
And it's there's this thing that goes on kind of like if something is removed, it was removed because they didn't like it. So you're not supposed to listen to it. But like
I don't think you can really say that about Elden Ring.
But I feel like the thing is that if you look at like precedent with these games, the DLC's almost always made up of stuff that they cut from the base game in the first place. Like the Artorias stuff in Dark Souls 1, that was in the base game. I think the fact that they finished all this St. Trina stuff, didn't put it in the final game, but then the DLC image is clearly Miquella, I think we're going to be seeing this anyway. Or at least some variation on it.
It's cool because we know exactly what the DLC is about, but they wrote it in such a way that they get to just thwart all of our expectations anyway. They did not paint themselves into a corner at all. Like, I think that's more what the stuff they cut. The stuff that makes the overall themes like a little bit too on the nose. And we can talk about that when we get to Frenzied Flame and all that.
Yeah, yeah. What we're going to go into here is like the concept of like characters not being tied to a specific like set existence that has set boundaries to it.
Right.
This is something that's like been in the series sort of since the beginning, but I think the most overt one is Dark Souls 1.
Please tell me more.
It opens very specifically, like it's incredibly on the nose. Or it opens by saying like at the start of everything was grey, everything was misty. There was just fog. Nothing really had any shape or form to it. There were creatures there, but they didn't have a lifespan. They weren't born. They didn't die. There's really nothing you can latch onto. And then suddenly there's this fire that appears. And when the fire appears, suddenly it throws everything into black and white in a sense. So you've got extremes of temperature. You've got extremes of light. You have the passage of time. Like the whole world changes. But what's interesting is like, that's not how the world is, like, quote unquote, normally. That's just what happens when there's the fire.
When there's gods. Or I guess the gods come right after.
Yeah, and what's happening is that the fire is imposing this upon the world, and eventually that fire is going to burn out. And when it burns out, all those things that were once extremely well defined start to sort of blend together and disappear again. And that's why I find, like, Gwendolyn and the undead to be so interesting, because like you have, Gwendolyn, who is, at least at the time of Dark Souls 1, they retcon it to hell later on, but kind of the last born of Gwyn, the last born of the person who's kind of like...
He's indicative of what's coming next.
Yeah, it's like this character who's like, what are they? Like, it's really not clear. Like, people will say, like, well, it says in the text, blah, 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 but like,
sure.
Every single piece of information you're given about Gwendolyn contradicts everything else.
Right.
Like the way Gwendolyn is portrayed in terms of the visuals, the way that the dialogue works, the way that they're talked about by other characters, the way they talk about themselves, the way they're described, like it's all contradictory.
Very godly.
To me, like that's the compelling thing about that character. It's not that you're trying to codify that, like, okay, this is what Gwendolyn is. It's that you have to sit down and you have to actually try to do it. Like, it's a character that sort of defies, like, you just doing a simple read on them. And also, like, the undead. Like, the idea that, like, what sort of heralds the fading of the flame, the fading of all these binaries and boundaries, is that these people start being born who aren't alive and they're not dead.
Right.
It's like, you're undead, you're not dead, you're not alive.
Straight up paradoxes.
It's almost like your existence is kind of like giving the finger to the idea of, like, mortality.
It makes the super undead people in Elden Ring, like, just kind of funny.
I was amazed that they did that as well. If you had said to me, like, Elden Ring is going to be about, like, an immortal traveler who crosses the fog to a mysterious land where they have to become Lord, I would just assume that was the Miyazaki puppet. Apparently, George R. R. Martin wrote that. And that is so bizarre to me. And yeah, Miquella / St. Trina, like, they inherit, I think, a lot of the qualities that make Gwendolyn interesting.
All my favorite parts.
Yeah. So do you want to just tell us a little bit, like, about St. Trina?
Yeah, absolutely. St. Trina is the lady I based my whole little, I guess my pen name, my moniker after. Because to me, she's a super powerful character, right? She's coded as, like, Miquella's final form. Miquella starts out as a man who is an adult, but still retaining his childlike form. But in his dreams, or maybe the dreams of others, not necessarily his dreams, but in the dream realm, that's usually where people see this figure as St. Trina, and St. Trina can appear as a man or a woman to people, but also is an adult form. So it's kind of like lots of hero quests are about coming of age stories of, like, teenagers. I think Miyazaki loves to do, like, 25-year-old coming of age stories. Or maybe like 23 to 27. Like, that's the zone, which is, like, I think really cool and interesting because it's more about, like, self-actualization without other people. Like, it's all about, like, distancing yourself from your parents, like the final layer, right? And, like, you just have to decide how you're going to exist in your society. So it's really interesting that right as Miquella is entering that phase in his life, that's when he starts imagining himself, or when St. Trina becomes, like, a prominent figure. So now all he has to do is turn himself into her. And so I think that's pretty cool. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and so St. Trina, like we mentioned before, there was a lot of stuff written about St. Trina and recorded about St. Trina, and it's technically in the game files, but they basically don't make it accessible.
Mm-hmm.
But it's sort of, I think it's worth looking at that because it gives you an idea of like the kind of character they had in mind, like with the sort of the ideas they were playing with St. Trina.
There's a lot of hints there already, I would argue. That even within the text is like you can still say I could still write like a, 7-page essay about it. And I
Yeah,
might.
absolutely, yeah. So like you were saying, St. Trina's power slash Miquella's power is that they can flow between these different realms of like waking and sleeping, and they do so in different forms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there are two quests associated with St. Trina that they didn't use. First one is that's how you would get the confirmation that Miquella and Trina were one person. Most people have probably figured it out anyway, because you can figure it out without being told. But there's this character called Rico.
Right.
Rico was an NPC who was a worshipper of St. Trina. They were determined to find St. Trina. You'd help them find St. Trina, and they'd discover, oh, it's Miquella.
Yes. I rewatched that one.
The second one is this is the one that interests me specifically. It's the Nomad Merchants.
Yes, me too. I wrote about it. It's great.
The Nomad Merchants, when they're by themselves, they play this very sort of mournful song on their instrument.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that like you'll notice if you talk to them a lot is that some of the ones you haven't met before will recognize you,
Right.
and it's like a big question mark of what the hell's going on? Why do you recognize me?
I love it.
And it's not in the retail version like actually paid off what's going on. But there's this removed stuff with the merchants and St. Trina where what happens is when the merchants are asleep because of the frenzied flame, their consciousnesses would start to meld together into one consciousness.
Mm-hmm. I think also when they're angry, it's a similar thing.
Yeah.
It's like either side of like two spectrums.
Yeah. Because the frenzied flame is like it's tied to this idea of like if you completely give in to despair, this thing comes out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it would turn out that that lullaby that they play on their little stringed instrument thing, that was something that St. Trina taught to them.
To quell the flame.
Yeah, that song was like a lullaby, and when they played it to themselves, it would calm the flame within them. And that does end up being like Miquella's kind of deal in the game, because that is how you get the needle that calms the flame. So there's still this connection between Miquella and calming the flame, but
Right, yeah.
it's just done in a different way.
A different method, yeah.
Yeah, so something that we brought up earlier is like there's a lot of characters in it that, like Miquella slash St. Trina, they exist on like a boundary between two states.
Yes.
So you have like the obvious one's Rani.
Yes.
But like Rani is dead in body but not spirit, and her spirit is in a doll that presumably doesn't look anything like Rani.
Right. Her spirit's not just alive, it's thriving.
Yeah, she's on this boundary, and then like happens to her brother as well, happens to Godwin. Godwin ends up on the boundary on the other side of it where his spirit is dead but his body is alive.
Yes. And his will explore more, almost certainly, in the DLC. His boundariness.
Yeah. And then there was this sort of question about like the way that those boundaries are imposed by the Golden Order.
Mm-hmm.
These things just sort of, they exist in the world, and the idea is like, but they shouldn't, so we have to force them to stop existing. So you had like we were saying, like those who live in death exist, but the way that like the Golden Order deals with that is to just have them killed. And then you also have like the misbegotten and the omens. It's like they're very like aggressive and monstrous when you meet them, but that's because like it's very heavily implied that's because of the way they're treated. Like the omens, when they're born, they're thrown in a sewer.
Yeah, I mean, they're all slaves.
They're treated like slaves, they're thrown in a sewer, and they even go into other interpretations of that with the perfumers, where they say, okay, but there were these perfumers, and they dedicated themselves to like healing and protecting the misbegotten. And that's why you see like perfumers and misbegotten working together.
Right.
The other character I thought was interesting with regard to that was Dung Eater.
Yes.
Because Dung Eater's whole thing with his rune is like, well, if I embed whatever the rune of the Fell Curse, if that's embedded in the Golden Order, then the Fell Curse still exists. Like the Omen is still around.
Right.
But we've just accepted that like they're part of the Golden Order now.
Yeah, I like it in a way.
Yeah, so it's like destroy the boundary of like what the curse is, and then like fear does the same thing, where it's like you have the principle of life within death. Nothing. I know that like it does change a little bit because like you see the world is different. It talks about the Duskborn are coming, but
Right.
at the same time, like what she's doing is she's just getting like here's the principle that you're rejecting, and I'm just saying it's actually part of the governing principles of the world now.
That's maybe part of why it comes out of them, because they're inserting themselves.
So something that you wanted to talk about with regard to Miquella was alchemy and syncretism.
In general, alchemy is like a thing that I know nothing exists in a vacuum, but alchemy especially does not exist in a vacuum. It's like a combination of several different schools of thought. So the symbols within are A, not consistent. I think that's the thing that people forget. And B, they're already what we would call syncretic. They're already symbols that somebody is borrowing from spirituality, borrowing from all these different fields of thought in their world and just calling it science, kind of. So it's just important to remember that every time that somebody comes through and they get a new recycling of those symbols, they have all this history on them, but that's not necessarily what the author's saying. So like every time somebody makes a new text or makes a new interpretation of an alchemical text, it's almost like, okay, now here's what the symbols mean in this person's mind who's interpreting this other person's mind. Um, Point is, when it comes to symbols, all of this stuff is perspective. And when we're doing our alchemical analysis of the story, and especially when it comes to Miquella, because there's tons of alchemy all over their area, there's like a bunch of hermetic symbolism in there. They are definitely referencing all that stuff, and I think it's like a treasure trove that we should all be clamoring away at as we do. But we also should say, like, okay, what is the story trying to tell us, and which of these symbols actually reinforce that story, and which ones don't?
The other thing that we really wanted to talk about was the Marika Radagon fusion. One of the things you constantly see in alchemical texts is like the man and the woman fused together. It's not so much that like you're literally just there refining some lead into some gold. It's like it's a spiritual refinement process. Like the lead is you.
Yep.
Like you're learning to refine yourself into something else, which makes that image of like the male and female kind of combined very kind of potent when we're talking about Radagon America.
Right, because you're making yourself into that godly contradiction at the end.
Yeah, which we were talking about this like on Discord the other day, and I brought up Falconelli. So Falconelli is like a very important kind of alchemical figure.
Mm-hmm.
They're not they probably didn't exist. Like I'm sure this is entirely made up. But basically the story of Falconelli is like they were the master alchemist and they actually were able to like refine sort of everything perfectly. And there's all these like alleged meetings with Falconelli. And what happens is like when Falconelli finally refines it, he's this 80-year-old man. And then it's like, and on the final meeting with Falconelli, it's this young, incredibly feminine looking person
Oh, okay,
because they
cool.
have like yeah
Right.
they have done that thing like they've combined male and female into this kind of androgynous sort of perfect body, and that's kind of what Radagon and America are doing. Like we have a whole episode on like Radagon and like the idea of Radagon being incomplete and needing to sort of break
Right.
himself down and combine with something else in order to make himself like to get that completion that he's searching for.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting to think like the two beings' intentions are so at odds. She hasn't really like unified with him in like an ethos way, so she can't really do it in a physical way either.
Yeah, that's the interesting part to me if we're talking about like the symbolism of like the male and female bodies fused, is that like when you encounter Radagon and Marika, it's Radagon and Marika. It's not a fusion of Radagon and Marika, really. Like you see Marika, she becomes Radagon. They're not one harmonious entity. And it even says that specifically with regard to the hammer that you get.
Right.
You get Marika's hammer, and it specifies like this is the hammer that Marika broke the ring with and that Radagon tried to fix the ring with. So they are against each other. Even when they're fused, they can't agree on something.
Totally opposed.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
really cool.
yeah.
It's really cool imagery. One other thing I wanted to add, I never found the video, but there is a video on Esoterica, which is a channel that I love, where he mentions that, at least in some alchemical texts, they would reference it as like the inner version of astrology. The astrology would be like how God perfects the world, and then alchemy is how we perfect the world. So in that version, it's almost like them interacting with the divine because we can't normally. And then they would also often do it when the planets are aligned a certain way in the heavens for like added effect.
Yeah, if you know your like astrological symbols, like the planets all have an associated metal.
Right, exactly. Because it's literally like the mirror image.
There's this notion in alchemy of like you melt things down to purify them.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that interesting with contrast to the frenzied flame.
Right.
Because the frenzied flame is like, in a sense, like what it's doing is it is melting down everything.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that what's left behind is, it doesn't seem like it's in any way hopeful.
Yeah.
It's like if you were trying to purify a metal, but you got it wrong.
Right.
And what's left behind is just like this sort of burned up heap of slag that's of no use to anyone.
Right. You just ruined it.
Yeah, you see like the lands between post frenzied flame, and it's not like a wasteland necessarily with nothing in it. It's actually just dead.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to me that there's a massive sort of lore dump from Hayata when you get it,
Right.
where she starts talking about like how all that is came from one thing and it was divided.
Mm-hmm. I put a lot of weight on that one.
Yeah, that to me is like fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Because it ties into everything else, like all these characters that are fractured and missing parts, and then breaking parts off themselves, and then having to like combine back together into one thing again. Hayata just lays out that's essentially the cosmology of this whole universe.
It's beautiful.
Everything was whole and it fractured, and everything that we have now is born of the fractures. But because they're fractured, everything's incomplete. So there's like suffering in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that fracture means like simultaneously everyone's suffering, everyone's missing something, but it also means that we're yearning to join with something else. And I just find that like really interesting.
Do you want to segue that into our little discussion about birth and death?
I think we should.
I think that seems like the perfect time.
Let's talk about fractures, births, and souls.
Absolutely.
Elden Ring is really, really interested in things being born, but not being born through what we'd consider to be traditional means.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like the best example of that is the Erdtree. Because like Marika, who's the goddess, like she's known for having all these children, but what she is associated with is this tree, and the tree is constantly reproducing, but it's reproducing of its own volition. It doesn't need anyone else to do it. It's just spreading.
You just have to put a body in the roots, basically, and it'll accept whoever.
Even then, like I don't even know if you needed to put bodies in the roots of the Erdtree necessarily. Like I think it's just a tree. Like if you have a tree will produce seeds, and they'll.
That's just what trees do.
When you start thinking of it in those terms, it's like you have Melania. Like Melania's got children, but she has children that like apparently just budded from her. It's almost like they were seeds that like the flower scattered.
I like to think of those particular ones as mushroom spores, just because of how much they seem like they're literally her in certain ways.
Yeah. And then you have like those children are sought out by Gowry, who is presumably not even a person.
I was thinking he's like rot itself almost.
And the pests themselves, like they just get spontaneously generated out of the Scarlet Rot. You'd think, oh, if you have like these like insect people, you would expect, like, according to the rules of like fantasy RPGs, there would have to be like a queen and a hive and everything, but there's not. And then like you have Rykard, like he talks about having a family, but his family is people he's swallowed.
Everything could be combined that way. With the jars and all that stuff?
Yeah, like every time I've written, I think I've written more down, there's more stuff. So there's like you have the jars, and the jars get stronger by shoving all these dead people in them. I think there's like, Alexander has a line the final time you meet him, where he says like, all vessels are destined to break.
Oh, I love that line. Yeah, that whole scene, they've really killed it.
Yeah, and then like we did a whole episode on artificial life in the Lands Between with Lore Hunter, but like, there's so much when you think about it. There's the Crystallians who like cannot reproduce. Someone made them from crystal, so everyone that dies can't be replaced.
Right.
There's also like the Albinorics, who are like artificial life. The Silver Tears are artificial life. And then you have like the Erdtree itself spawns its own kind of sentient beings with regard to like, there's these Erdtree avatars, there's these snake things, there's these the wood folk, the sort of tentacle faced things, like they're presumably from the tree as well. You have the people that guard the tree becoming hosts to these like tree branches growing out of their backs.
Oh, the Guardians, yes.
Things are reproducing life and reproducing themselves, but none of it's happening through any kind of traditional birth.
It's like transmutation just all over the place in whatever format.
You know, in going back to alchemy, the idea that like you get this metal, you refine it, you make gold out of it. That's sort of what the crucible does. Like it had like purified life, just like the
Exactly.
essence of whatever the hell that was.
Broken down. It had been juiced.
Yeah, you had this stuff, and then you that it's like, you know, God shaping man out of clay.
Yes,
Like
absolutely.
they shaped life out of the crucible, but because the crucible was everything mixed together, when life happens, like it's got little like redundant bits of other life in it that you maybe weren't planning on being there. So you start getting like the misbegotten who are like, oh, when you touched the crucible, like you made humans and you made animals, but also created the misbegotten, who are like creatures that are like, it's are they human or are they animal? And like there's not even one kind of misbegotten. Like there's some that are very like bird like, there's some that are very lion like, there's some that they just sort of seem almost like an ape. Like there's all these different kinds of misbegotten. And then what's like really interesting there, which like we've talked about a bit before, is like Godfrey touches the crucible, something happens, and then one of his kids is an omen.
Right.
And it's like, is Morgoth the way he is because Godfrey touched the crucible?
Right. Oh, that's interesting because I thought it was always just like inherent to Godfrey because of the time that he was from.
It might be.
But I think it works great both ways.
Yeah, it's like it's really like Godfrey's timeline is a little confused. The timeline of the whole game is like, I don't want to say the timeline is confused because I'm absolutely certain there is like a timeline.
Right. It does seem like it.
Like
Yeah.
somewhere, like I'm sure all of this does line up. They just left it out.
Yeah. So we've talked a ton about things being mixed and separated throughout this whole episode. One spirituality that I don't know if it's necessarily like the driving force of Elden Ring or anything, but it's one that I wanted to put on your radar, and that is Hinduism and specifically Shakti, Shaivism, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Rani is a blue deity with 4 arms, and there's a lot of allusions, so it's very unclear, but it seems like perhaps the primeval current is just everywhere, right? And it's something that is just like waiting to be tapped in, but it's unclear. And we talk a lot about how things can be separated and things can be put back together, and how it's all one big cycle that definitely does not end when you die. I think that there is something to be said in that spirituality because that spirituality says that all things are one thing and all things are Shiva. And it's such a large and complex system that you can't see it as one thing. So it would make sense that you have to give up your body and you have to be one with kind of the universe and give up that sense of self a little bit. And I think that may be what Rani is alluding to when she goes to the stars. I think a lot of people have taken that ending to be more literal than I do. But anyway, I just wanted to get your temperature check on that, I guess, because alchemy is a symbolic system where everything is connected and everything flows together. Yeah. What do you think?
I'd have to read up more on it because I don't really know anything about Hindu. I mean, like the name Rani is Hindu. Like it's the feminine version of Raja.
Oh, really? Oh, I forgot about that. Yes. That's amazing. So yeah, so there's a lot of little hints that like Rani might have some Hinduism inspiring her, and it just makes sense that crossing that boundary of death in particular is like the way you get there to like where this every flowing thing is. It actually is a nice way to kind of like full circle us a bit on our discussion tonight, because it goes back to the original thing that I said, where in lots of different spiritualities, just spirituality in general, gods not only can change states, but gods and godly mixtures, aka the Philosopher's Stone, that's like supposed to be a divine entity almost unto itself. those things, they also create paradoxes, and they're also allowed to create paradoxes because they're God, and basically they get to cheat. I'm just going to speak literally about myself now. I definitely had trans people in my life, but for whatever reason, that little needle was not allowed to come towards me. Fast forward to like 27 or something, and I just like saw a friend of mine have a more feminine look on an Instagram story and like makeup and stuff for a wedding. And I was like, oh, you can just choose to do that. Just do this. And it really does feel kind of godlike because in an instant, you're like, oh, my self-image is just different. And then once you realize you can do that, then you can control where it goes and you can literally take control of your destiny. So I think that a lot of people that like comparative spirituality and they like reading a lot of different religions, like it seems like Miyazaki is trying to give you a map. And they go, okay, you tell me what you think about God at the end. And I love it because it kind of just like solidified what I was already doing in my head, which was just like being like, I'm in control of what happens, even if there's a lot of other things too.
Yeah, we talked about that, like with regard to Dark Souls, particularly 2 and 3.
Mm-hmm.
Because Dark Souls 1 like gives you a very stark choice of like it's either fire or dark.
Mm-hmm.
And then what starts doing with Dark Souls 2 is the ending is deliberately open-ended.
Right.
Because the whole point is like throughout the game it's saying you're going to be king, but what kind of king will you be?
Very Elden Ring.
The power of the monarch comes from the ability to choose the kind of world they're going to make.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just shows you sitting on the throne. And the kind of world you want to make is up to you. It's not going to show it to you because everyone's going to want a different one.
That's it.
Yeah, and then like Dark Souls 3 kind of goes in that direction, but not to the same extent, where it's bringing up all these concepts like, the age of the deep sea is the one everyone remembers, but there's also like, the profaned flame and all this other stuff that like could potentially happen now that like the world is dying, like what will come next. It's not as open-ended about it, but they're still there.
Right. It's it's more reminding us that, okay, Dark Souls is done. It's done. You can put it down. We'll start again.
That's what I find just interesting about Elden Ring is that it's not very like eschatological.
What does that word mean?
It's like at the end of days is happening, but at the same time, like it's sort of assumed, unless it's the frenzied flame, obviously, that it's just going to end with someone else on the throne, and they're going to come up with their own world.
Yeah.
That's why I find like all the historical stuff, which is presumably all Martin stuff, like we don't find out a lot about like the Crystallians, we don't find out a lot about the Onyx laws, we don't find out like why there are these massive ruins embedded in the sides of the mountains, we don't know where like the big skulls came from.
Right.
But like the fact that they're there at all is just signaling to you like, okay, the world was around before you and it's going to be around after you.
That's awesome.
I guess to finish up, like, do you want to just talk about like what you think and hope for the DLC?
Whew.
We still have nothing for the DLC apart from the image of Okay, I just want to be clear. Some people are saying you don't know it's Miquella, and there are people who are saying it's like a young Marika and everything, and like it is entirely possible
Right.
that the DLC will land and that is a young Marika, but based on what we see of Miquella and what we see of the DLC, the character in the DLC looks exactly like Miquella. So we're going with it's Miquella.
Yeah. So I have two things to say. First, a plug. On my YouTube, my very first video is speculations on the DLC using alchemy symbolism and stuff like that. And I'm going to do a part 2. I'm going to come up with a bunch of stuff there. But one thing I wanted to point out that most pertains to what we talked about today about like multiple identities, senses of selves, and being able to control your sense of self is the braids. There are a lot of different braids, and here's where I'll shout out my homie Emily is the Pants. She's a lore girly on Twitter. We've just talked a bunch about the braids in the game. Godfrey's in particular, she has a bunch to say about Godfrey braids, but Godfrey has like 2 braids coming down the side, and then the rest of his hair is like mangled. So you can kind of imagine the braids as like his 2 identities of like Horalu and Godfrey, and then he loses one halfway through. If you imagine braids as like identities, And St. Trina is like a dream lady who's like also Miquella, also like 5 other people. If you're talking about a character that has that many different identities, and they're supposed to be like the final boss of spirituality, basically, it makes sense that that person would have hella and dope braids. And this character has that. This character has giant wavy hair going all the way past her ass. And there's like 4 strands, I think. There might have been more than that. I think it's 4. But anyway, that's more than anybody has had before. And like Marika has 1, and Radagon has 1, and so it makes sense that as you're getting further away from Marika on like the proliferation of separateness, eventually there's going to be like a being that's like, I'm everything all at once. I'm coming.
That's actually tying into something that like we didn't talk about yet, and we may as well talk about it now, which is like the idea that Miquella is kind of like doing what Marika did, but properly.
Right, exactly.
He's always associated like not with gold, but with unalloyed gold.
Yes.
Unalloyed gold is pure gold.
It's very malleable. It's very easy to change form.
Yeah, so you have like Marika, who's like gold, 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 and then you have Marika's child, who quite overtly like says this isn't solving our problems, leaves, makes their own holy tree.
Makes better gold.
And makes better gold. And also, like, if you look at like Miquella doesn't have like children, as in the sense like Miquella's not giving birth, but there's all these people flocking to the Haligtree. It's like Miquella is like Miquella and St. Trina, they are the ones who watch over like the people who are cast out. So you have like the Misbegotten and the Albinorics and everything, all these people that the Golden Order doesn't want anything to do with. They're all flocking to Miquella as this kind of like messianic figure. Which I think is interesting in the way it ties back to Marika, who's like seen as this very motherly figure. But at the same time, like, she's a terrible mother.
Yes. I think that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, she is awful. Like, she treats all of her children just like pawns. She's had these children, and then she's basically like, okay, I have one that's important because he's the heir. And everyone else just go, and she literally tells them just like, go kill each other, and I'll see who's the strongest. Like, she's appalling.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to compare that to Renala, because Renala is the opposite of that. Like, when you meet her, she's calling forth all of the people she sees as her children.
Right.
When you defeat her, she's left cradling the egg. That's like where those children were rebirthed from, and like she's desperate to have that sort of maternal connection. They're all gone, and also her actual like offspring have been taken from her. I guess the final thing to mention with Miquella with regard to that is like there is an unused Miquella ending, and I suspect we will probably get something like it in the DLC.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's this Miquella line that's like, let all things flourish, whether graceful or malign.
Right. That one I didn't know. Okay.
Marika's obsessed with like an epoch of life, but she's also obsessed with putting down very hard boundaries around what's allowed to be considered life. Whereas Miquella is more like everything is just going to, it doesn't matter what you are. It doesn't matter if you're artificial. It doesn't matter if you're half lion. It doesn't matter if, you know, you're a weird ball person with no legs that like rolls around with a tuba. Like, everyone is welcome here.
Yeah.
In a sense, he's also like, he's kind of doing what the Flame of Frenzy's doing, in that he's like taking away despair by removing the boundaries between things, but he's doing it in a way that's like not literally burning the world down.
Right.
He's saying like, all these people who are different, all these people who don't belong, who are outcasts, everyone come together here. And I really hope they do something with that in the DLC. I'm also wondering if they'll reveal something horrible about him, because
I'm really holding my breath.
Everything we've said so far makes him sound too good.
Yeah, I know. It sucks.
It would be nice if there was like one of these games where there was one nice person.
Right. And it's a trans girl. Like, let's go. W.
Do you just want to quickly, before you go, do you just want to plug your social media? You're on Twitter a lot. You're also you stream a lot on Twitch. You have a YouTube channel. You use that. Is it the whiteboard thing? Is it called Mesa or something? Miro. Yeah. You've been putting together like Always Sunny memes, sort of like conspiracy boards explaining how this all works.
Miquella got me into that.
Yeah, and like you've again, like it's a good way of talking. Like you've worked with Quella, you've worked with people like Last Protagonist. So you're very active in the community.
Yeah, honestly, I'm just gonna give you my Linktree because like it's a little bit too hard to navigate all my stuff without it right now. On a regular basis, I'm on Twitch playing old From Software games. I'm gonna play that old Lost Kingdom card captor game pretty soon. Every once in a while, I'll do those Miro boards and do like a big episode and put it onto YouTube. Before I was just making the boards themselves with just words, but now I'm gonna make everything nice and YouTube-y, and so the Trans Between is like my big flagship thing that I did with Jean. That's like my baby, and that one's just in text format for now, so if you go to my Linktree, that's like the first one under lore theories. But if you just stick around and wait, I will be making a new Trans Between. So like I kind of did it in the wrong order. I wrote a big final essay and then said, wait a second, I'm not good enough at this stuff yet. Let me go back, do a bunch of fun stuff, collab with people, and get good so I can come make another final essay someday, because I think this game is pretty special.
Okay, so thank you very much. This is usually where Sin does the outro, but she's not here. So thank you everyone for listening. And I'll see you all next time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Bye, everybody.
Bye.